There is a moment, and most people only get one in their entire lives, where everything they have ever quietly endured, every compromise they swallowed in silence, every night they lay awake, staring at a ceiling, wondering if any of it was worth it, all of it, every single buried feeling rises to the surface and demands to be seen. Most people crumble in that moment. Most people cry. Most people reach for someone to hold them together because they don't trust themselves to hold together on their own. Margaret Harlow was not most people. On a gray Tuesday morning in the fall of 2021, inside a wood-paneled courtroom in Claremont County, Ohio, Margaret Harlow sat across from the man she had loved for 22 years, the man she had built a life with, the man who had decided, without warning, without apology, with the cold efficiency of a business transaction, that she was no longer worth keeping. She sat there perfectly still, no trembling hands, no red eyes, no tissue folded in her fist the way women grip them in courtrooms when they are trying not to fall apart in public. She simply picked up the pen, looked down at the divorce papers that her husband, Dennis Harlow's team of 3 attorneys had spent 4 months preparing, and she signed her name. Slowly, deliberately, like she had been rehearsing this moment for years. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the ink on the paper. And then Margaret Harlow looked up, and for just a fraction of a second, just long enough for the people watching from the gallery to catch it and never forget it, she smiled. Not a smirk, not a performance. Something quieter than that. Something that looked to everyone in that room like a woman who already knew exactly how the rest of this story ended. Before we go any further into Margaret's story, we want to pause and say, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, let's talk about what nobody in that courtroom understood on that Tuesday morning in October 2021. Dennis Harlow walked out of that courthouse with what his legal team had described, privately and rather smugly, as a clean sweep. He had the house, the 4-bedroom colonial on Lakeview Drive that Margaret had decorated room by room over 2 decades. He had the investment accounts. He had the retirement funds that bore both of their names, but that his lawyers had argued, successfully, were primarily funded by his income. He had the Porsche and the lake house in Kentucky, and the commercial property portfolio that had made him, by his own public estimation, one of the 20 wealthiest private real estate developers in the state of Ohio. And Margaret had walked away with a modest cash settlement that Dennis's lead attorney had the audacity to describe in a local business journal interview published 3 weeks later as more than generous given the circumstances. The circumstances: 22 years. 2 miscarriages she had carried largely alone while Dennis was traveling for work. 14 years of teaching elementary school in a district that had tried to cut her program 3 times, and a prenuptial agreement she had signed at 29 years old, before the wedding, before she had her own attorney review it, before she fully understood what she was agreeing to. Dennis had smiled when she signed that too. He had a habit of smiling at contracts, so did she, as it turned out. But their smiles, it would emerge, meant very different things. Here are the 3 questions that everyone, Dennis's lawyers, the local press, the people who had known Margaret for decades, would spend the next 6 months desperately trying to answer. Why did she sign without a fight? What did Margaret Harlow know that nobody else in that courtroom knew? And what exactly was the charcoal gray Rolls-Royce Phantom that appeared outside her modest rental home in Appleton, Ohio, 6 months after she walked out of that courthouse, with 2 black SUVs behind it, and men in suits who did not look like they belonged anywhere? Within 50 miles of that town? To understand what happened after that courtroom, you have to understand who Margaret Harlow was before Dennis. And to understand that, you have to understand Appleton, Ohio, because places shape people in ways that are impossible to separate from the person they eventually become. Appleton sits in the southwestern corner of Ohio, about 30 miles east of Cincinnati, in the kind of county where the diner on Main Street has had the same owner for 40 years, and the high school football team still draws the whole town out on Friday nights, regardless of whether the team is any good. It is not a glamorous place. It is not a place people tend to write articles about or hold up as an example of the American dream in motion. But it is a place where people work, where they show up, where they do the quiet, unglamorous business of living without expecting applause for it. Margaret Ann Harlow, née Margaret Ann Briggs, was born in Appleton in 1971, the second of 3 children of Raymond Briggs, a coal freight dispatcher for a regional logistics company, and Donna Briggs, who worked mornings at a diner called Patty's and Evenings doing alterations out of the back bedroom of their house on Cedar Street. Raymond and Donna were not wealthy people. They were not people who talked about wealth as something that belonged to them or to anyone they knew, but they were people who believed, with a quiet intensity that Margaret absorbed without ever being told directly, that the most powerful thing a person could possess was knowledge that nobody could take away from them. Raymond Briggs used to say it at the dinner table. He said it the way people say grace, routinely, sincerely, without needing to explain it. Nobody can repossess what's in your head, Maggie. Margaret heard that sentence approximately 400 times before she turned 18. It lodged somewhere she could not have located on a map, but that would prove, decades later, to be the most important real estate she ever owned. She was, by every account from teachers, classmates, and neighbors who knew her growing up, a quiet child. Not shy exactly. Quiet in the way that attentive people are quiet. She listened before she spoke. She watched before she acted. Her third-grade teacher, in a quote that her mother Donna saved in a shoebox and that Margaret still has, wrote on her report card, "Margaret has an extraordinary ability to notice things other children miss. She will go far if the world is patient enough to let her." Margaret did not go far geographically. She stayed in Ohio. She attended Cincinnati State Technical and Community College, where she earned her associate's degree in early childhood education, and then transferred to the University of Cincinnati on a partial scholarship, where she finished her bachelor's in education and graduated in 1994 with honors and with $17 in her checking account. She student taught at an elementary school in a lower-income Cincinnati neighborhood for a year, was offered a full-time position, and took it. She was 23 years old. She wore the same 3 pairs of shoes for 4 years. She packed her own lunch every single day. She stayed after school 3 evenings a week, without additional pay, to run a reading group for kids whose parents worked double shifts. This was not a performance. This was not something she talked about. It was simply what she believed teachers were supposed to do. She was, in the language people use when they are not sure how else to describe a certain kind of quiet excellence, the real deal. She met Dennis Harlow in the summer of 1999 at a fundraiser for the Claremont County Community Foundation held at the Elks Lodge in Appleton, an event Margaret attended because a colleague had an extra ticket, and Margaret, freshly returned to her hometown to take a position at Appleton Elementary, thought it might be a good way to meet people in the community she was returning to serve. Dennis was 34 years old. He had already built 2 successful apartment complexes in the Cincinnati metro area, was in the process of acquiring a commercial strip mall in Loveland, and had the kind of easy, forward-leaning confidence that fills a room without apologizing for it. He was handsome in a way that photographed well. He knew how to listen, or at least he knew how to perform listening, which in a social setting is nearly indistinguishable from the real thing. He asked Margaret about her work. He asked follow-up questions. He laughed at the right moments. He called her the following Wednesday and suggested dinner at a restaurant in Cincinnati that required a reservation 3 weeks out, and when she asked how he'd gotten a table on such short notice, he just smiled and said, "I know people." Margaret was not swept off her feet. She was not built for that kind of sweeping, but she would later admit to a close friend, genuinely charmed. "He seemed like someone who paid attention," she said. "I thought that meant he understood things." They dated for 2 years. They were engaged for 8 months. They married in June of 2001 at a small ceremony at a Methodist church in Appleton with 47 guests and a reception at the same Elks Lodge where they had met. Margaret wore her mother's earrings. Dennis wore a suit that cost more than Margaret's first car. In the photographs from that day, the kind that sit in albums and on mantelpieces and that people look at later and try to read for signs they should have seen, Margaret is smiling the way people smile when they believe in what standing in front of. It is a real smile, wide and uncomplicated. The smile of a woman who has no idea yet how much she is going to have to learn. The prenuptial agreement arrived 6 weeks before the wedding, delivered to Margaret in a manila envelope by Dennis's personal assistant, with a yellow sticky note attached that said, in Dennis's handwriting, "Just a formality, Maggie." Standard stuff for someone in my position. Margaret was 29 years old. She had no personal attorney. She had no experience with legal documents beyond the lease on her apartment. She read the agreement twice, understood about half of it, and told herself, as people tell themselves things when they want very much to believe them, that a man who loved her would not put something harmful in a document he described as a formality. She signed it. Dennis had it notarized and filed the same afternoon. The agreement, as it would be explained in detail 2 decades later by the attorneys who reviewed it during the divorce proceedings, was not standard. It was comprehensive, meticulous even. It covered marital assets with a degree of specificity that spoke to the hand of someone who had thought very carefully about what he stood to lose. Any assets acquired during the marriage using Dennis's income or investment capital were his alone in the event of divorce. The family home was his. The investment accounts were his. His business holdings were protected by a corporate structure that predated the marriage and therefore fell entirely outside its jurisdiction. Margaret would retain personal property and a cash settlement calculated at a fixed rate based on years of marriage, a number that in 2001 dollars had seemed reasonable, and that in 2021 dollars, relative to what Dennis had accumulated, was something between an insult and a joke. Dennis's lawyer had called it generous. He had said that word with a particular confidence of a man who has never had to live on what he considers generous. What the prenuptial agreement did not address, what it could not address, because it had been drafted in 2001 by attorneys working from a list of assets that existed in 2001, was anything Margaret might build on her own outside of marital finances in the 20 years that followed. This was the gap. This was the silence in the document that Margaret Harlow, in the years to come, would learn to read the way a navigator reads open water. Not as emptiness, but as possibility. But we are getting ahead of the story. In the early years of the marriage, none of this was anywhere in Margaret's mind. She was not plotting. She was not scheming. She was simply living the way people live when they are still hoping that what they chose is going to work out the way they imagined it would. The first years were good or good enough. Dennis was busy, increasingly, relentlessly busy, but Margaret understood ambition. She respected it. She had her own work, her own students, her own small but meaningful universe at Appleton Elementary, and she was content to let their lives run on parallel tracks, meeting at dinner and on weekends, and on the vacations they took each summer to places Dennis chose and Margaret quietly packed for. The first miscarriage came in 2004. Margaret was 33. Dennis was at a conference in Columbus when it happened. She called him. He drove back the same night, and he was kind. He was capable of kindness, Dennis, in moments that demanded it. But he was also distracted in the way that people are distracted, when they have not yet fully absorbed that. Someone else's pain requires them to stop moving. He was back at work the following Monday. Margaret took a week. She went back to her classroom the next Monday, too, because her kids were waiting, and because she did not know where else to put what she was carrying. The second miscarriage came in 2007. Dennis was in Louisville. He sent flowers to the hospital. They were white lilies, her least favorite flower. She had told him this. She kept them on the kitchen table for a week anyway. By 2008, something had shifted between them in a way that neither of them named directly, but that both of them could feel. Dennis had begun spending 3, sometimes 4 nights a week in Cincinnati, claiming the commute was eating into his productivity. Margaret did not ask too many questions about those evenings. She was, by nature, a person who believed in giving people the space to be honest, without crowding them into a corner. She would later reflect that this quality, which she had always considered a form of respect, had, in the context of her marriage, functioned more like willful blindness. She was not oblivious. She simply chose for a long time to believe in the version of her marriage that she could still live with. And it was in that same year, 2008, that everything began to change. Not with a confrontation, not with a revelation, with a budget meeting. In the fall of 2008, the Appleton Claremont School District announced a budget shortfall of nearly $2 million. The art program was cut immediately. The after-school tutoring program was suspended. And the science and mathematics enrichment curriculum that Margaret had spent 4 years developing, a program that had, by that point, produced 3 regional science fair winners and raised the district's 4th grade math proficiency scores by 23 percentage points, was placed on the chopping block. Margaret was told, in a meeting with the district superintendent and 2 board members, that the program would be eliminated at the end of the academic year, unless an alternative funding source could be identified. She was also told, with the particular helpless sympathy of administrators who have run out of options, that there was nothing the district could do, that the state funding formulas were what they were, that she had done extraordinary work, and it was a real shame. Margaret sat in that meeting for 45 minutes and said very little. She asked two questions. She thanked them for their time, and then she drove home, sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and a pot of coffee, and began to teach herself the basics of nonprofit grant writing, intellectual property law, and educational curriculum licensing. Three subjects she knew nothing about, and that she would spend the next 6 years mastering with the same quiet, methodical intensity she brought to everything she decided mattered. She started with books. Library books first, then textbooks she ordered online. She took two community education courses at the local library, one on small business accounting, one on intellectual property basics. She enrolled in the fall of 2009 in an online certificate program in financial planning offered through Ohio State University Extension, completing it over 14 months while continuing to teach full-time. She told Dennis she was taking online courses for professional development. He nodded and went back to his phone. He did not ask which courses. He did not ask what she was learning. He had by that point settled into a version of their marriage in which Margaret's interior life was a country. He had stopped trying to understand. This suited Margaret fine, because what she was building, slowly and with extraordinary care, in the spare hours between school and dinner, and the life she was still trying to maintain the appearance of, was something she did not yet have a name for. By 2010, she had drafted a formal curriculum framework for her science and math enrichment program, not just the lesson plans and materials she used in her classroom, but a comprehensive, replicable educational model, complete with teacher training guides, assessment tools, and implementation protocols. She filed for copyright protection on the materials in the spring of 2010. It cost her $112. She paid with her own checking account. In 2011, at the suggestion of a contact she had made through one of her online courses, a woman named Patricia who worked in educational publishing in Columbus, she filed for a provisional patent on a specific assessment methodology she had developed within the curriculum, one that used pattern recognition exercises to identify early numeracy gaps in second and third graders. The filing cost her $400. She paid for it by selling, on eBay, a set of china she had inherited from her grandmother, and that Dennis had always considered ugly anyway. He did not notice it was gone. In 2012, the first licensing inquiry arrived. A school district in southern Indiana had heard about Margaret's program through a regional education conference and wanted to know whether the curriculum materials were available for purchase. Margaret spent 3 months researching educational licensing structures before she responded. When she did, she proposed a tiered licensing model, a one-time implementation fee, an annual licensing renewal, and a training consultation rate for districts who wanted her to personally guide the rollout. The Indiana district agreed to her terms. The first check she received was for $8,400. She deposited it into an LLC she had quietly formed 6 months earlier, Harlow Educational Innovations, LLC, using an address in Cincinnati and a registered agent who had no connection to Dennis or to anyone Dennis knew. She told no one, not her sister, not her closest friend Carol, not her mother, who was still alive then and who would have been so proud she would have called everyone she knew. Margaret kept it to herself because she had learned, in the years since that prenuptial agreement, something important about the relationship between silence and safety. She had learned that what people do not know about you cannot be used against you. Between 2012 and 2019, Margaret Harlow licensed her curriculum to 11 school districts across Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, and West Virginia. She refined the program each year based on outcome data she collected from partner districts, turning what had started as a single classroom's worth of materials into a research-backed, professionally documented educational framework that independent evaluators, hired by two of the larger adopting districts, rated in the top 3% of commercially available elementary STEM curricula nationally. She raised her licensing fees twice. She added a summer teacher training intensive that ran for 4 days each July, held at a conference center in Columbus, and that was consistently oversubscribed by the second week it was announced. The revenue was modest by the standards of the world Dennis operated in. In a good year, the LLC generated between $60,000 and $80,000. It was not life-changing money, but it was hers, entirely, legally, documentably hers, earned before the marriage's financial entanglement had extended to her. earned in an entity she had formed independently, funded entirely from intellectual property that existed before anyone could claim a share of it. She invested the proceeds carefully, guided by a fee-only financial advisor in Columbus named Robert Finch, whom she had found through a referral from Patricia in educational publishing, and who asked no questions about why the schoolteacher wanted to keep her financial affairs entirely separate from her household accounts. Robert Finch had seen enough in his career to understand that there are circumstances in which that kind of separation is not just prudent, but necessary. He helped her open a modest brokerage account. He guided her through her first equity investment, a position in an index fund that grew slowly and steadily and that she added to every quarter without fail. He also, in the spring of 2014, mentioned in passing that one of his other clients, a former student at Ohio State, now working in Columbus's emerging tech scene, was looking for early-stage investors in a healthcare software startup he had founded with two colleagues. The company was called ClearPath Health Technologies. It was pre-revenue. It was, by every conventional metric, a risk. Margaret had never invested in a private company before. She spent 6 weeks researching the founders, the market, the technology, the comparable companies, the exit history of similar ventures. She read everything she could find. She called Robert Finch 3 times with questions. She drove to Columbus on a Saturday in September 2014 and sat for 2 hours with the startup's founder, a 27-year-old named James Elwood, and asked him questions that, James would say in an interview 6 years later, were sharper and more technically informed than those he had received from the 2 venture capital firms who had passed on his initial round. She invested $40,000. It was the majority of what she had saved over 2 years of licensing revenue. She did it through her LLC. She told nobody. Dennis was in Miami that weekend, attending a real estate investment summit. He sent her a text on Saturday night that said, "Hope you're not too bored." "Back Monday," she replied with a thumbs up. Then she drove home, made herself a cup of tea, sat at the kitchen table, and looked at the paperwork in front of her for a long time. She was 43 years old. She had been married for 13 years. She had signed a prenuptial agreement in a room without a lawyer, and she had spent every year since quietly, patiently, methodically building a position that no prenuptial agreement could touch. She did not know yet that Dennis was planning to leave. She did not yet know about the woman in Cincinnati, the one he would eventually list in the divorce filing as simply a friend, but she knew something. She could feel it the way you feel a change in the weather before any instrument confirms it. Not a specific knowledge, but a readiness, a settled, unshakable readiness. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday morning in August of 2021. Margaret was in her classroom, preparing for the first week of school. She had a meeting at 3 p.m. and a stack of new student folders on her desk. Her phone buzzed with an alert from the registered agent service for her LLC. A separate notification, not related to the papers. And then, 20 minutes later, a process server walked into the school's front office and asked the secretary if Margaret Harlow was available. She was called to the front. She signed for the envelope. She carried it back to her classroom, set it on the desks beside the student folders, and finished preparing her materials for the afternoon meeting before she opened it. She read through all 47 pages that evening at her kitchen table. She read them the way she read everything, slowly, carefully, noting the language that was precise and the language that was vague, and the places where the document's authors had clearly been very confident that the person reading it either could not or would not push back. Dennis's lead attorney was a man named Gerald Hutchins, a partner at a Cincinnati firm that specialized in high-asset divorce and that had a client list Dennis had mentioned, more than once, with quiet satisfaction. Gerald Hutchins had drafted a settlement structure that, by any straightforward reading, left Margaret with the equivalent of a consolation prize. The family home, valued at $900,000, would go to Dennis, who would also retain all joint investment accounts, his commercial real estate holdings, the Kentucky Lake House, and both vehicles. Margaret would receive a lump sum cash settlement of $220,000, the contents of her personal bank account, and her personal property. Hutchins had cited the prenuptial agreement at every relevant juncture in the document. He had been thorough. He had been, from the perspective of someone operating entirely within the boundaries of what he knew, brilliant. He did not know what Margaret knew. Nobody did, except Robert Finch in Columbus, Patricia in educational publishing, and the registered agent in Cincinnati. none of whom Dennis or his team had any reason to contact. Margaret read those 47 pages twice. She made 3 notes on a legal pad, and then she called a law firm in Columbus. Not a local attorney, not someone Dennis knew, not anyone connected to the Claremont County legal community in which Dennis had relationships and reputations, and she asked to speak with the firm's senior partner on the matter of a high-asset divorce with specific questions about LLC held, intellectual property, and equity positions established prior to financial commingling. The senior partner took the call himself. His name was David Park. He had 26 years of family law experience and a particular expertise in cases involving assets that were either hidden, misrepresented, or, in the rarer and more interesting cases, he described as architecturally protected, structured in such a way that they existed entirely outside the reach of marital proceedings. David Park later said in an interview with a legal trade publication that covered the case in a brief but admiring article that he had never had an initial consultation quite like the one with Margaret Harlow. She didn't come to me asking whether she could win, he said. She came to me asking whether the position she had already built was as protected as she believed it was. I reviewed the structure over 2 days, and I told her yes, it was better than she thought. Margaret retained David Park and his firm the following week. She did not tell Dennis. She did not contact Gerald Hutchins. She did not respond to the divorce filing in any way that suggested she had any awareness that the situation was not exactly what Dennis believed it to be, a straightforward execution of a prenuptial agreement against a woman with limited resources, limited legal representation, and, Dennis had apparently decided, limited understanding of what was happening to her. The hearing was scheduled for October 14th, 2021. Margaret had 2 months. She spent those 2 months doing what she had always done when the world required something of her. She showed up to school. She taught her students. She packed her own lunch. And in the evenings, she sat at the kitchen table with David Park's team on the phone, and they went over every document, every filing, every detail of the corporate structure she had built over 13 years until there was not a single question she could not answer and not a single challenge Dennis's attorneys could raise that she and David Park had not already addressed. She was ready the morning she walked into that courtroom. She had been ready in some sense for years. Gerald Hutchins opened the proceedings with the confidence of a man who has already won. He laid out the settlement terms. He cited the prenuptial agreement. He referenced the asset disclosures. He did not look at Margaret often, and when he did, it was the kind of glance that conveys, more clearly than words ever could, that a person has already categorized you and moved on. David Park said nothing. Margaret said nothing, and then, at the moment, when the judge asked whether the parties were prepared to proceed to signing, David Park leaned forward and said, quietly, with the particular restraint of someone who knows they do not need to raise their voice, Your Honor, before we proceed, my client would like the record to reflect that she is signing this agreement with full awareness of its terms, and that she wishes to waive any and all right to contest the agreements or terms as presented. She is satisfied with the settlement as structured. Gerald Hutchins looked up. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did. A flicker of the thing that happens when you realize, too late, that a sentence contained information you did not expect. Why would anyone waive their right to contest? Why would anyone, facing a settlement of $220,000 against a marriage to a man worth $47 million, be satisfied? He had no answer in that moment. The judge acknowledged the statement. Margaret picked up the pen. She signed slowly, deliberately, and when she set the pen down and looked up, the people in the gallery would remember that look for a long time. It was not anger. It was not grief. It was the look of someone who has been carrying a long secret and has just quietly set it down. Appleton noticed things. It always had. A town of that size, with that kind of long institutional memory, noticed when the Rolls-Royce Phantom appeared on Sycamore Street on a Thursday afternoon in April of 2022, 6 months after Margaret Harlow had moved into the small rental house on the east side of town. A 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom house with a carport and a garden she had already started, despite having no guarantee of how long she would be there. Carol Whitfield, Margaret's closest friend since the 3rd grade, and now a licensed practical nurse at Claremont County Memorial, was driving past on her way to pick up her daughter from volleyball practice when she saw the car. She slowed almost to a stop. She later said it was the kind of vehicle you simply do not process as real when you see it in a neighborhood like that one. charcoal gray, immaculate, the kind of car that does not arrive accidentally in a place. Behind it were two black Chevrolet Suburbans with tinted windows and, Carol noted, license plates registered in Delaware. Three men in dark suits got out of the second SUV and walked to the front door of Margaret's rental house. They were carrying briefcases. Margaret opened the door before they knocked, which meant she was expecting them, which meant she had known they were coming, which meant that whatever this was, it was not a surprise to her, even if it was a surprise to everyone watching. Word traveled the way. Word travels in Appleton, through text messages and pickup lines at the school, and over the counter at the hardware store, and across the parking lot of the Kroger on Route 132. By that evening, three separate people had called Dennis Harlow to tell him what they had seen. Dennis dismissed the first call. He was, by April of 2022, already navigating some significant complications in his real estate portfolio. A refinancing on his commercial properties had become more difficult than anticipated, and two of his largest tenants had terminated their leases earlier than expected, leaving him with vacancy rates that were uncomfortable, but, he told his business partner Phil, manageable. He took the second call about the cars at Margaret's house with more attention. He took the third with something approaching unease. He called Gerald Hutchins the following morning. He wanted to know if there was any possibility at all, that something had been missed. Gerald Hutchins told him there was not. He was certain. The prenuptial agreement was sound. The settlement was signed. Everything was clean. He told Dennis that Margaret had probably come into some unexpected money. An inheritance, perhaps, or maybe a new relationship with someone wealthy. Some women land on their feet, Hutchins told him. She was always a smart woman. He said it the way people say things like that, as a compliment layered over a dismissal, acknowledging intelligence in the past tense, as though it could not possibly be relevant to the present. Dennis hung up the phone and sat with the unease for a moment longer than he expected to. Then he went back to work, because Dennis Harlow was, above all things, a man who believed in forward motion and standing still to wonder about Margaret felt. He told his business partner later, like giving her more credit than the situation required. This was, as it turned out, the last significant miscalculation of his professional life. The first theory Appleton settled on was the one that required the least imagination. Margaret had inherited money. Someone had died and left her something. People recalled a distant aunt in Columbus, a childless uncle in Cleveland. The story grew legs on its own, the way stories in small towns do when people are uncomfortable with the alternative, which is that someone they have known their entire lives has been quietly doing something extraordinary that none of them noticed. A brief item ran in the local weekly paper. Local resident comes into unexpected fortune. Nobody confirmed it. Nobody denied it. Margaret, when neighbors stopped by or called, was warm and gracious and said nothing at all about what the cars had been there for. She asked about their kids. She offered coffee. She was exactly the same as she had always been, which, in retrospect, should have told people everything. The inheritance theory held for about 3 weeks until a woman named Sandra, who worked in the records department at the county courthouse and who had a well-developed habit of connecting things that other people filed separately, noticed that a Columbus attorney named David Park had filed a brief on behalf of a Margaret A. Harlow LLC in a federal intellectual property matter the previous winter. Sandra mentioned this to her sister-in-law. Her sister-in-law mentioned it at a book club. Someone at the book club mentioned it to a woman whose husband worked at a regional bank. That man, who knew Dennis professionally, mentioned it to Dennis over a round of golf. Dennis arrived home from that golf game in a state that his housekeeper would later describe to a neighbor as very quiet, which was the kind of quiet that was worse than loud. He called Gerald Hutchins that evening. Hutchins told him to calm down, told him there was nothing an LLC filing could mean that would change the terms of a signed and court-acknowledged settlement agreement. But he also quietly opened Margaret's file again that night, and he read through every page, and he began to feel, for the first time since the October courtroom, the specific and deeply uncomfortable sensation of a man who has overlooked something he cannot yet identify. The story broke publicly in June of 2022 in a piece published by the Cincinnati Business Courier under the headline, Ohio Educator Behind Surprise $31 Million EdTech Equity Windfall. The journalist who wrote it, a business reporter named Alicia Drummond, who covered the regional tech and investment scene, had been tipped off by a source in the Columbus venture capital community who had noticed, In reviewing the disclosed equity holders of a major acquisition, a name that did not fit the profile of the other investors, a small LLC called Harlow Educational Innovations, registered in Ohio, held by a Margaret A. Harlow of Appleton. Alicia Drummond spent 3 weeks verifying the story before she published it. She called David Park, who confirmed that his client had authorized limited comment. She called the acquiring company's PR department, who confirmed the acquisition terms on the record. She called Robert Finch, who declined to comment but did not deny anything. She called James Elwood, the founder of ClearPath, who had by then moved to San Francisco and who spoke about Margaret Harlow with a warmth and specificity that made very clear she was not to him an abstract investor, but a person who had shown up when nobody else would. She believed in what we were doing before we had anything to show for it, James told Alicia Drummond. She asked better questions than our venture partners. And she was the most patient investor I ever worked with. She never called asking for updates. She said once, early on, she said, "I invest in people, not timelines. Just keep doing the work." I've never forgotten that. ClearPath Health Technologies had been acquired in November of 2021, 1 month after Margaret signed the divorce papers, by a national health information management company for $340 million. Margaret's equity stake, accumulated through her initial $40,000 investment and 2 subsequent small follow-on investments in later funding rounds, had been valued at $31,200,000 at closing. The acquisition had been structured as an all-cash deal. The funds had transferred to Harlow Educational Innovations LLC in December of 2021. Because the investment had been made entirely through the LLC, an entity formed before the marriage's financial commingling, funded entirely by premarital intellectual property licensing revenue, and structured with the specific and documented guidance of a corporate attorney. It was David Park had confirmed entirely outside the jurisdiction of the divorce settlement. It did not appear in any of the asset disclosures. It was not required to. Margaret had not hidden it. She had simply built it in a place that the prenuptial agreement's authors had never thought to look, because they had never imagined she would have anything worth looking for there. The Courier piece ran on a Thursday. By Friday afternoon, it had been picked up by the Associated Press. By Saturday, it was on the front page of the Cincinnati Enquirer, the Columbus Dispatch, and 3 national business publications. Gerald Hutchins, reached for comment by the Enquirer, said he had no statement at this time. Dennis Harlow did not return calls. He was, according to multiple sources in the Claremont County real estate community, not in a position to take calls that weekend. He had read the article. He had read it multiple times. And somewhere in the 3rd or 4th reading, the thing that had been nagging at him since the October morning she signed those papers, that half-second smile, that particular quality of stillness, finally resolved into something he could name. She had known. She had known the whole time. The question everyone asked, once the story was public, was the obvious one. Why didn't she fight for more in the divorce? She had $31 million in a protected LLC, a legitimate intellectual property portfolio, generating 6 figures in annual licensing, revenue, and a legal team that, according to David Park, speaking carefully but clearly on the record, could have challenged several elements of the prenuptial agreement on the grounds of duress and inadequate independent counsel at signing. She could have gone to war. She chose not to. The answer, when Margaret eventually gave it, in a single brief interview with Alicia Drummond, published in August of 2022, which Margaret agreed to on the condition that it focus on the educational curriculum licensing program, rather than the personal circumstances of the divorce, was characteristically quiet. "I didn't want his money," she said. "I never wanted his money. I wanted the life we were supposed to be building together, and when it became clear that life wasn't real, I wanted out cleanly. I wanted to be done. Every day you spend fighting someone in a courtroom is a day you are still connected to them. I had no interest in being connected to Dennis any longer than was absolutely necessary." She paused. She looked at the reporter. "And I already had everything I needed," she said. "I'd had it for a while." The school donation was announced quietly in a press release issued by the Appleton Claremont School District in September of 2022, an anonymous donor, later confirmed by the district superintendent, who could not quite keep the emotion out of her voice at the board meeting where it was discussed, had made an endowment gift of $8 million to permanently fund the science, mathematics, and arts enrichment programs at Appleton Elementary and 2 other district schools. The gift was structured as a perpetual endowment, meaning the principal would never be drawn down and the programs would be funded in perpetuity from investment returns alone. It was, the superintendent said, the single largest gift in the school district's history. It was enough to fund every program that had ever been threatened by a budget shortfall for the next 100 years, conservatively modeled. The superintendent did not read out the donor's name at the board meeting. She didn't need to. Everyone already knew. Carol Whitfield, who attended the board meeting and who had been crying quietly since the third sentence of the superintendent's remarks, said afterward that she had called Margaret immediately and asked her why. Why that amount? Why the school? Why not keep it? Travel? Buy the house she deserved? Do something for herself after everything she had been through? And Margaret had said, and Carol repeated this in the parking lot of the school district office building, while still wiping her face. Carol, that school is the reason I became who I am. Those kids in those classrooms right now are going to become who they're going to be because of what they learn there. That's the most important real estate there is. It's what my dad always said. Nobody can repossess what's in your head. In the interest of completeness, it is worth noting what happened to Dennis Harlow in the 24 months following the divorce. His real estate portfolio, which had been showing stress before the divorce proceedings began, deteriorated significantly through 2022 and into 2023 as rising interest rates and tenant departures compounded on each other in ways his financing structures were not built to withstand. Two of his commercial properties went into default. A third was sold at a substantial loss. The Porsche was sold in early 2023. The lake house in Kentucky was listed in the spring of that year and sat on the market for 8 months before, selling at a price his broker had privately advised him was too low to accept, but that Dennis by that point did not have the liquidity to refuse. Gerald Hutchins remained his attorney through most of this period, navigating a series of creditor negotiations that were, by several accounts, from people in the Cincinnati real estate community, genuinely difficult work. None of this is presented here as satisfaction. Margaret Harlow, when asked in the one interview she gave whether she felt any sense of vindication when Dennis's financial difficulties became public, answered without hesitation. No, she said. I genuinely don't. I feel sorry for him, if I'm honest. He spent 22 years married to someone he underestimated, and that's a waste of a marriage. But it's also a waste of a life. His. He could have been paying attention to something real. He chose not to. She said it without anger, without triumph, with the same composed steadiness that had been misread in that courtroom as passivity. It was not passivity. It had never been passivity. It was the specific stillness of a person who has done the work, knows the outcome, and no longer needs anyone else's acknowledgement to confirm it. There is a particular kind of story that American culture has always told about wealth and success. The story of the self-made man, the aggressive builder, the person who moves fast and loudly and claims territory. Dennis Harlow had that story. He told it well. He had believed it completely. And for a long time, the world around him had believed it too, including for a while, Margaret. What Margaret Harlow's story offers is something different. It is the story of what happens when a person decides that the most powerful thing they can do is become impossible to underestimate, not loudly, not performatively, not in a way that demands anyone else's recognition before the moment is right. Just quietly, methodically, every single day, learning one more thing, building one more layer, protecting one more piece of what was hers, until the structure she had built was so sound that no one could touch it. She was a school teacher from Appleton, Ohio. She had a legal pad and a library card, and a father's voice in her head, telling her that nobody can repossess what's in your head. She had 14 years and patience, and the extraordinary conviction that her own intelligence was worth investing in, even when nobody around her was paying attention. The Rolls-Royce on Sycamore Street was never really about money. It was the visible marker of something invisible, a long, quiet choice, made thousands of times in small rooms when nobody was watching, by a woman who understood, better than almost anyone around her, the difference between what people see and what is actually there. And if there is a question worth sitting with, not just for the sake of this story, but for the sake of your own, it is this: what are you building right now that nobody around you knows to look for? And are you being patient enough to let it become what it could be? Because Margaret Harlow was. For 22 years, she was. And when the moment finally came, she picked up the pen and she smiled. We want to hear from you, genuinely. The question we are leaving you with today is not a rhetorical one. It is something we think is worth a real answer in the comments below this video. Have you ever been in a situation where the people around you underestimated you? Where you were written off, passed over, or dismissed, and you had to make the quiet, difficult decision to keep building anyway, without anyone's acknowledgement, without the validation you deserved? Or maybe the reverse. Have you ever been on Dennis's side of that story and looked back later and realized what you missed? Drop it in the comments. The most powerful things in this community happen in that section below the video. We have read stories down there that have genuinely moved us, and the conversation that follows this video is one we are genuinely curious to be part of. And if you are new here, if this is the first story of ours you have watched, we want you to know that this is what we do. Real stories, told the way they deserve to be told. Without shortcuts, without sensationalism. Just the truth, laid out with the care it earned. If that is something you want more of, hit that subscribe button. This is a small thing that genuinely matters to this channel. And that means you will be here for the next story, which is one that, we promise you, you are not going to be able to stop thinking about once you start watching. A man spent 11 years in a federal prison for a crime he did not commit. The person who put him there was someone he trusted completely. Someone he had trusted his entire adult life. And the way that story ends, we will just say this, it ends in a place nobody expected. That one is coming soon. Until then, thank you for being here. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. And take care of yourselves out there.